What's up, Colorado Realtors? I'm Scott Peterson. Thank you for joining me for another quarantine edition of Legal Bites. Now, before I get started, many of you might notice I've upgraded my quarantine room. I was finally allowed, out of the basement and up to the surface. I feel as if I'm just as we as a state, we're taking baby steps and moving from stay at home to safer at home, and eventually to full engagement, hopefully again with each other. But I've risen above the basement level and did a little upgrade for my quarantine room here, which is nice, and got a little bit more going on behind me here. Hopefully you don't mind the colorful frog that's floating around over my shoulder. So anyhow, that's good news on my end. Haven't been with you guys in about a week, and it's, let's see, the 7th, May 7th, about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and wanted to do this to talk about three things specifically here with you guys today. May 7th, we know May 8th was a big date for a number of counties, particularly in the metro area. Don't want to say statewide, but I think beginning after tomorrow, so it'd be Saturday, 12:01 a.m. theoretically, many of the inconsistent, particularly larger counties, are falling off of their own local jurisdictional limitations on showings and other activities. And so I think effective this weekend, we're going to see a lot more uniformity with regard to much of Colorado. I can't say all, but much of Colorado, and large portions of Colorado population that are abiding all equally by the same order, the current safer at home order that Governor Polis has issued that goes through the end of May here. So that's good news from my perspective. It's going to cut down on a lot of confusion and disconnect between certain cities and counties with regard to what can be done under any local jurisdictional orders. And again, that is in many cases going to come beginning Saturday morning, 12:01 a.m. I'm not going to get into the individual jurisdictional things because we've got, like I said before, 64 counties. So it's very hard, even then when you throw additional municipalities on top of that some of them have their own limitations. So as you're as you're doing your realtor businesses in different areas, make sure that you are looking obviously at the state order and the limitations there. And I spoke in the last Legal Bites pretty extensively about what the state order says with regard to showings and other business expectations, but then consider your county, and then you might, if a property is located within a municipality that you think has their own limitations, then check with the city government, the city websites, and that kind of thing before you just rush out and do your business. But I do think we will have a lot more uniformity across the state in terms of everybody adopting the safer at home policy. And that's going to make my life a little bit easier and the hotline a little bit easier. So that should come, like I say, Saturday morning. Very early, unless there's changes that are made independently. So that was one thing I wanted to mention. Next thing I want to mention is some advisories, some buyer and seller COVID advisories. So just to begin with, you're going to be getting linked with this YouTube video. I don't know if it'll be below, or if you're getting this on Facebook, it'll be maybe above. Wherever it's going to be, somewhere around this screen, there should be links for you guys to click on that will take you to a page where you'll be able to download one or both of two different documents. One is a buyer COVID advisory, COVID-19 advisory, and the other is a seller COVID-19 advisory. So these advisories are just about a page and a half long. They're meant to be used if you're a buyer. If you're working with buyers, then you'd have your buyers sign the COVID advisory. If you're working with sellers, you'd have your seller sign the seller COVID advisory. And so these are not, unlike what I know some people might be using now, liability shifting documents. In other words, these are not disclaimers or waivers or indemnifications. These don't do anything to shift liability. And as many of you know, CAR can't do that. We're not allowed to practice law for all of our 27,000 members around the state. And so we can't prepare those documents. If you've gone to an attorney and you've had a law firm or your attorney prepare some waiver of liability or indemnification documents or whatever you've got out there, disclaimer documents. That's up to you to use. We'll see down the road, the effect and enforceability of those things. But nonetheless, if you've got those, then you're free to continue using these. What these advisories are informational, and it's meant to go into a broker's file after they've worked with a buyer or before they work with a buyer or a seller in this sort of COVID pandemic timeframe, to give to the buyer and say, hey, review this thing and just acknowledge your receipt of it. So again, it's not going to shift liability. What I do think, I hope that what they will do is meet or exceed any standard of care expectations that might be had for a broker with regard to working with a customer in this uncertain time. And so it is something you want to have your buyer or seller sign as is appropriate, throw it in your file, and at least you've got some evidence that, hey, you didn't just sort of act like, oh, it's just business as usual and nothing to worry about buyer, nothing to worry about seller. So there could be some good implications for a broker that actually has gone to the trouble to review it with their client, have them acknowledge it and put it in their file. If the client were to later catch COVID through some real estate activity or whatever, and they were to say, well, you didn't tell me about the concerns or the dangers or anything else, you would be able to pull out of your file a hot little document that says, well, we actually did talk about it and here it is. So again, not a liability shifting document, but I think they're very appropriate for use. And again, I would encourage you guys to click wherever around my head and get those things. I want to shout out for these documents and support for these documents is my friend and colleague, fellow real estate lawyer, Damian Cox. And Damian and I started working on these things back probably 5 or 6 weeks ago now, originally, when we were still under the stay-at-home order. And under the stay-at-home order, people were still doing showings because we hadn't received the Attorney General's interpretation that we finally got that said no showings. And so even at that time, we were kicking around language and putting together these advisories based on our knowledge that showings have some risk associated with it, and real estate transactions generally for specifically buyers and sellers have some additional risk in this COVID time. And then that sort of got put on hold on my end specifically because we had strict showing, exclusions both at the state level and then up and until through this weekend, we've had a lot of additional kind of wonky local level ones. And so Damian, as he does in so many respects for our industry as a whole, kind of button these things down from that. And so now it's appropriate that we as CAR are rolling them out as well, considering that we are going to see, I think, a lot more showing activity and in-person engagement in the state based on the new Safer at Home order that was adopted about a week and a half ago. So it's an appropriate time to roll these things out now. Again, download them from wherever around me you're watching this video. They should be available to you. And if you have questions about when and how to use them, obviously CAR Legal Hotline is available for that. So the last thing I want to mention, and again, just to reiterate, thank you to Damian for everything you do for the industry, but really refining these and getting them to a point where they're great and ready to churn. So appreciate that. And if you know Damian or run across him, then make sure you give him not a high five, but an elbow or something, whatever it is. But he does an awful lot and always for years has done an awful lot for the industry. So. Okay, last thing I'm going to touch on is who's responsible for, as you guys know, under the Appendix B of the order or of the public health order from the CDPHE. Under Appendix B, there's a laundry list of things that must be done, as well as in the definition of what a field services worker is. That specifically says that that between showings, a property must be cleaned and sanitized. And so I've had a ton of calls and inquiries from brokers on the hotline saying, well, who's responsible for that? Is it the listing broker? Is it the seller? Is it the buyer's agent? Who's responsible? Well, here's the answer, guys. It's the listing broker and the buyer's agent, because you are both field service workers under the definition. And so the public health order doesn't delineate, well, the listing broker must ensure that it's cleaned in between showings, or Upon exiting, the buyer broker has to ensure that it's clean. It doesn't say that. It just says that field service workers, as they're engaging in their critical business under the Safer at Home policy, need to ensure that. So what does that mean? It means that you guys are going to have to coordinate and cooperate with each other. It's a case-by-case kind of answer. Sometimes the property's occupied, and maybe the listing broker can coordinate with the seller to make sure the seller's wiping down surfaces. Sometimes it's an unoccupied property. Maybe the listing broker has to encourage the buyer broker or insist that the buyer broker goes back in and wipes down any surfaces that have come into contact with third parties. Maybe the listing broker's got to go do it themselves. I'm not exactly sure who's going to do it on a case-by-case basis. I think, again, this is where you guys as real estate professionals, as realtors, it's another form and level of cooperation that is expected between the buyer's agent and the seller's agent as they're coordinating showings and who's going to be responsible for this. So as a best practice, as you guys know, it makes the most sense to make sure that before a buyer's agent and their buyers enter a property, to the extent possible, that you've gone around and that lights are turned on and doors are opened, and the greatest amount that you can, as a listing broker or a seller, that you can limit touches from people because the buyer's got to go turn on and off lights or open and close doors or open and close cabinets or just touch things generally. The more you can limit that, the less surfaces you have to be concerned about. But if you're not taking those precautions, then I think you got to go and pretty much clean every doorknob and clean every handle, door handle, everything else. But if you can limit that by using the best practice of minimizing touches on the listing broker side, you're going to leave a lot less surfaces that need to be disinfected or sanitized between. But in terms of responsibility, I wouldn't get lost in the details of who's responsible. I would just make sure that you guys are both coordinating and both acting responsibly to make sure it gets done. So anyhow, that's where I'm going to leave it for today. Check out these advisories wherever they are. And I'm getting a haircut next Saturday. So I'm now Saturday the 16th, I think it is, 15th, 16th, whatever it is, I'm scheduled. And so you can stop looking at this mug. Anyhow, we'll see you guys at some point next week, I'm sure, on another edition of Legal Bites. If you have questions about the state order, as some of you folks are transitioning out of local, more restrictive orders, feel free to utilize the hotline. Myself or the other attorneys that answer it can kind of talk you through the nuances of the state order if that's a newer thing for you. And questions about using the advisory, any of those things, feel free to call the hotline. And we'll look forward to talking to you there. And we will see you next week, I'm sure, on another edition of Legal Bites. Thanks so much.